Okay, so for this chapter, we're going to be doing basically the MPEP 1900 plus a little bonus. So if you remember when we did the MPEP 1100, we talked briefly about how third-party pre-issuance submissions are located there in the MPEP, but instead of talking about it there, we're going to talk about it here because this is kind of a good area to discuss all pre-publication submissions. So, for starting with protests, these are the actual subject matter of 1900. So now anyone can file and remain anonymous. It must be timely submitted. It has to be served upon the applicant if it isn't the patent owner or anyone related to the patent, of course. What is the time period for a protest? That's going to be before the notice of allowance, before a final rejection, before the publication of application. So if any of those have occurred, then a protest is no longer eligible to be received. Now, there is no fee if it's their first time submitting a protest. And as far as what documents can and should be submitted, you have to submit the references, as usual, a copy of them, the translations, and then a concise explanation of relevance. And so when you're making this concise explanation, you can discuss a little bit about how it does relate to the current patent. So as far as post-publication protests, this is only eligible if the permission of the applicant has been obtained in the original application. So if the applicant says, yeah, if you want to submit that, you can go ahead as a way of maybe avoiding IDS or something like that, then in that case, they can get the permission of the applicant to do that. It can also be done throughout the pendency of a reissue. And so it's best if it's filed within 2 months of filing a reissue. So if you remember from reissue, when after they're filed, they announce in the official gazette. And so if somebody looking through the official gazette sees something and knows that they have prior art that would be relatable to this, then they can go ahead and submit a protest, and you want to do within the first 2 months because sometimes that period can get waived, if you remember. As far as the statutory requirements, so what publications can fall under, it can be anything related to 101, 102, 103, and 112. And it can be, and you can submit anything related to patentability. So that can be patents, published applications, just regular publications, and any information adverse to patentability. And then protesters, if they're only able to submit only partial pieces of information, if only partial pieces of it are relevant. So there might be a case where there is some foreign patent, they're only able to obtain part of it, then in that case, you only provide translations for part of it. For the requirements to submit, you have to have a written and identifying application number in question. So whatever the application number is. So obviously you have to have knowledge of whatever that application is. A proof that the copy of the protest was served upon the applicant or attorney. And if you look in the MPEP 1900, it's a really short chapter. There's a whole list of all the things that you have to try before you can give up, say that you have exhausted all the ways to serve it upon the applicant. And if no proof of service can be achieved, then in that case, duplicate copy should be submitted to the PTO. And then, of course, it should be explained why it couldn't be served. Protests also need to have complete copies of all documents. An incomplete protest cannot be fixed by the protester. So the contact with the protester starts and ends with the filing. And so if there's not complete copies, they're not going to come back and say, hey, we noticed that you missed this, because then that would almost make the PTO a party to the protest. Now, if you really have to submit a second protest, then you have to explain how the new issues are different, why different issues were not earlier presented, and then a processing fee, right? Because this time only at the first one free. And yes, the participation of the protester ends with the filing of the protest. So as far as just some miscellaneous rules here, a non-compliant protest, it could be entered. It just kind of depends on the examiner. The period for comments by the applicant is not required. So if you remember with some of the other ones, there's a period for comments, or probably more in the ones that are coming. There's a period of comments by the applicants. But in some cases, the examiner may realize that these articles are related to the patentability. And so in that case, they may ask the applicant if they would like to respond and give a 1 month period. And then a protester, they can't ever get confirmation that the application exists. So remember, when they are submitting it, they submit with the application number. So somehow they did figure that out. But if the USPTO gives any sort of proof or confirmation of receipt, then they would know that the application exists. And in that case, that would be violating some of the confidentiality of 122. So now the other part of 1900 is a citation of prior art. So we'll talk about that with reexamination. And it's just a really small part. It's just one small little section of the MPEP 1900, but we'll talk about that more with reexamination, because citation of prior art and reexamination can both be done throughout the enforceability of a patent. And so therefore it kind of makes sense for those to be talked about together. Yeah, through pendency. And both citation of prior art and reexamination are focused on the patents and printed publications. But citations of prior art can also include statements of patent owner, which is a pretty important distinction. So now back to third-party pre-issuance submission. So going all the way back to MPEP 1134, but still relatable here. So they make sense to talk about here because they are both prior to publication pretty much. And you want to do it the earlier of the date of notice of allowance, or the later of 6 months from publication, or the first rejection from examiner. And this feels like a very counterintuitive rule. So kind of the way I would go about finding the date if you are asked. So you find the dates of all three, find the later of part B. So just kind of break it up into pieces. This sounds very obvious, but it can be really confusing if you're given a lot of facts in a case. And so just first find the dates of all three, find the later of part B, then compare that to the notice of allowance to find the earlier of A and B. As long as you remember the earlier of date and notice allowance, or the later of, or the earlier of date and notice allowance, or the later of 6 months from publication, first rejection. As long as you can remember those and then just kind of piece it together from there, you'll be okay. But it can be very confusing if you haven't practiced this at all or don't have this memorized. And it has to be submitted before the date, not on the date. So that's kind of an important distinction. There's a lot of those which can be submitted the day of, right? If it's filed on or after is usually what we say, or on or before. But with third-party pre-issuance submissions, this is one of few where it must be submitted before the date, not on the date. So good one to remember. So now, while the RCE does not reset the clock, it also doesn't preclude submission if it's still within the period. So if an RCE is filed and it hasn't passed the 6 months from publication, and in that case, then there still could be a submission. So further talking about this, it has to be in writing and include a list of items, a concise description of items, which is not a chance to argue against patentability. So when we talked about protest, remember protest, that one, you can specifically relate how these things are related to patentability. You can say this maybe should lead to a rejection under XYZ. But for third party, you cannot do that, because that would just be violating the rules of it. You have to have a copy of each non-US document. So if it's a US patent or patent application, you just have to have the number, because those are easily findable. And then, of course, English translations is necessary. And then a statement stating compliance with submissions with statute and rule. So that statement is saying that the individual who's submitting it is not anybody with a duty to disclose. So remember, or actually we'll talk about it in MPEP 2000, but anyone with a duty to disclose is any person who's involved really with the patent. So if they're involved with the assignee, the inventor, the applicant, or if they are those people, then they all have a duty to disclose. And so in this method, it cannot be used as a way to get around a duty to disclose in order to submit IDS or anything like that. Now, the documents which can be submitted are going to be a US patent application, a foreign patent, a non-patent literature, so any sort of publication. And so, yeah, so that's all that can be submitted with a third-party pre-issuance, versus, remember, with a protest, you can submit any item related to patentability. So further talking about this, there's a fee when it's over 3 items and a first submission. So up to 3 items is free as long as you have a statement saying that it's your first submission. You have to claiming it, and then that fee would cover 3 to 10 items, and then additional fees are calculated per 10 items thereafter. So that concise description that we talked about a moment ago, it's not treated as evidence. It is only relevant to the application. And there is a small discount, small entity discount is available, but micro entity is not available. So that's a pretty big distinction because remember, small entity, 50% off, micro entity, 75% off. So, I mean, you're still definitely getting a discount, but maybe could be an area for some questions. And there's no service on the applicant required. So that kind of takes some of that effort out of it. As far as certificate of facts or transmission provisions, they are both eligible for third-party pre-issuance submissions. So I think that is it. And I'm actually just going to jump over to duty to disclose so we can knock that out. It's really short. All right, so 2000 duty to disclose. So that's kind of what we talked about a moment ago. It's under 1.56 as the attorney, inventor, anybody involved with the inventor, with the assignee, and it only is individuals, not corporations. So as far as what is required for duty to disclose, it's anything material to prosecution. So if it establishes alone or in combination obviousness cases, if it refutes or is consistent with inconsistent with a position taken by an applicant in an argument, that would be a big one, right? If an applicant is saying that something is some chemical boils at some temperature when that person or when the practitioner knows that it is not true and knows that the applicant knows it's not true, then it's their duty to disclose to the PTO. And now prior art is anything that's material before the effective filing date. So even if it can be sworn back of. Awesome. And that is it. So hopefully that is helpful. Thank you.